ask that Mr. Brown lead off. We are here for 2 hours, and I'm anticipating some order in the first hour of the usual asking of questions, and maybe a little less formality in the second hour as we dive deeper into C-59. I appreciate the interest of all the members of the departments, plural, in the deliberations of the committee, and this is an opportunity for the committee and the various officials to interact on both a semi-formal and a less formal basis. So with that, Mr. Brown.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I'll make a few opening comments, and then I think my colleague Shelley from Communications Security Establishment will also have some opening comments. I'm pleased to have the opportunity to appear with my colleagues today to discuss Bill C-59, the proposed National Security Act 2017. As you can see, I'm joined by officials from the public safety portfolio, including the RCMP and CSIS, the Communications Security Establishment, and the Department of Justice. Je tiens tout d'abord à remercier tous les de leur examen.
I would like to begin by thanking all the members of this committee for your thought and diligent examination of this legislation.
Goodale's mandate with regard to national security. It is also the result of an unprecedented nationwide public consultation, one in which this committee played an important role. The consultations undertaken by Public Safety Canada and the Department of Justice involved an online questionnaire, in-person town halls across the country, social media engagement, and much more. In total, tens of thousands of views were heard, collected, documented, and analyzed. Of course, this committee held numerous meetings of its own on the topic of national security. Le projet de loi tient compte de tout.
The proposed legislation reflects all of this input from citizens, parliamentarians, community leaders, national security experts, and academics.
59 has 3 core themes. Number 1, enhancing accountability and transparency. This would be done through the proposed creation of an intelligence commissioner and a national security and intelligence review agency, both of which would complement the work of the newly established National Security and Intelligence Committee of Parliamentarians. My pages are sticking together. Number 2, fulfilling mandate commitments with respect to the former Bill C-51. This includes proposed revisions to threat reduction activities under the CSIS Act, amendments to the Criminal Code, improvements to the Secure Air Travel Act, and revisions to the Security of Canada Information Sharing Act. And number 3, ensuring that our national security and intelligence agencies can keep pace with the evolving nature of security threats. This includes measures such as modernizing the CSIS Act, establishing the Communications Security Establishment Act, and making other legislative updates. Bref, le projet de loi C-59.
In short, Bill C-59 is designed to update and modernize Canada's national security framework to reflect current realities. Its overall objective is to keep Canadians safe while safeguarding our rights and freedoms.
Bill achieves this objective. Minister Goodale signaled his intention for a thorough review and analysis of its content as it proceeds through the parliamentary process. Beginning this past summer and continuing through to the new year, officials from Public Safety Canada and from across the Security and Intelligence community have engaged key stakeholders. In many ways, this has been a continuation of the conversations that began with the national security consultations in 2016, which I mentioned earlier. Ces discussions et interactions.
The aim of these discussions and interactions has been to not only respond to technical questions about the content of the bill, but also, and most importantly, to receive feedback and input about how it can be improved.
Meetings and exchanges with the Office of the Privacy Commissioner of Canada, the Security and Intelligence Review Committee, the Office of the CSE Commissioner, and the Civilian Review and Complaints Commission. Nous avons aussi eu plusieurs échanges avec d'éminents.
We've also had a number of exchanges with prominent academics in the field of national security in order to receive constructive feedback to help ensure the bill achieves its objectives. I can assure you that these have been very helpful to everyone involved.
in the deliberations of this committee, including the testimony of witnesses and the detailed written briefs made available on the committee website. I should note that, although separate from Bill C-59, the government announced in June that it would be adopting a national security transparency commitment to be applied across Canada's federal national security apparatus. Public Safety Canada is exercising a leadership and coordination role for implementing that commitment and supporting the establishment and operation of an advisory group. This work will complement the ultimate objectives of C-59. Le ministre Goodale cherche à avoir une conversation ouverte.
It is Minister Goodall's aim to have an open and thorough conversation in order to make sure that this bill is as good as it can be.
Here before you today, and we look forward to responding any questions that the committee may have about the bill. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Ms. Bruce?
Thank you. Monsieur le Président, distingué
Chair, distinguished members of the committee, I am Associate Chief of the Communications Security Establishment, and I'd like to thank you for the invitation to appear before you today as you continue your study of Bill C-59, including the CSE Act. I'm happy to be here in front of the committee to explain and clarify certain aspects of this important legislation.
remarks made by Minister Sajjan when this legislation was last discussed in the House of Commons. The minister said, "There can be no greater obligation than to protect the security of Canadians at home and abroad. Bill C-59 would provide CSE with the authorities and tools to maintain the highest standards in security protection while adhering to the high standards of accountability and transparency." CSE has helped protect the security of Canadians for over 70 years by providing critical foreign intelligence about threats to our national security and our deployed forces, and by protecting Canada's most sensitive information and information systems. In order to deliver this important mandate, governments throughout those 70 years have expected CSE to respond to the priorities of the day and ensure it stays ahead of evolving global threats and constantly changing technology, and to meet those challenges while protecting Canadians' privacy, their rights, and their freedoms. That is what the proposed authorities and accountabilities in the CSE Act do. They would provide CSE modernized authorities to help keep Canadians and Canada safe and secure against global threats, including cyber threats in a rapidly evolving technological world. They would provide new accountability measures to ensure that CSE's activities are authorized, reviewed, and as transparent as possible. As the committee has studied this bill, a number of important questions have been raised. I would like to address a few of the more common ones now. First, I'd like to address the provision in the proposed act around publicly available information. Questions have been raised about how CSE would use publicly available information and what impact that would have on the privacy of Canadians. To be clear, this provision exists only to allow CSE to conduct basic research in support of its mandate from the sort of public resources that would be available to anyone in Canada. CSE does not and would not use publicly available information to investigate Canadians or persons in Canada or build dossiers on them. That is not our mandate, and for us, mandate matters. The proposed CSE Act reinforces this by explicitly requiring that CSE have measures in place to protect the privacy of Canadians and persons in Canada in the use, retention, and disclosure of publicly available information. So how would we use that publicly available information? I can provide 3 quick examples. First, we could use it to provide general background information for a foreign intelligence or cybersecurity report. Second, we could use it to assess the nationality of an individual or organization. Third, we could use it to consult technical manuals associated with new technologies or infrastructure. Under no circumstances would CSE use this provision to acquire information that was unlawfully obtained. Hacked or stolen data would not constitute publicly available information under the CSE Act. This committee has also heard questions about the proposed active cyber operations aspect of CSE's mandate, including questions on how they would be used and the potential impact on Canadian privacy. As this is a new authority for CSE, I want to clarify what this means. Active cyber operations would allow CSE, within strict legal parameters and with approvals at the highest levels of government, to take action online to disrupt foreign threats, including activities to protect our democratic institutions, to counter violent extremist and terrorist planning, or to counter cyber aggression by foreign states. For example, CSE could use active cyber operations to prevent a terrorist's mobile phone from detonating a car bomb. We could impede terrorists' ability to communicate by obstructing their communications infrastructure. Or we could covertly disrupt a foreign threat actor from interfering in Canada's democratic processes. The proposed legislation is also clear in the limits built into this authority. CSE would be prohibited from directing active cyber operations at Canadians, at any person in Canada, or at the global infrastructure in Canada. The Act would also require that these activities be reasonable and proportionate. It would specifically prohibit CSE from causing death or bodily harm, or willfully attempting to obstruct, pervert, or defeat the course of justice or democracy. Let me underscore the fundamental change in our approach to ministerial authorizations. Bill C-59 builds on CSE's current ministerial authorization regime by broadening its application and introducing new and important oversight and review functions. Under the Act, CSE will seek a ministerial authorization for any activity that would interfere with the reasonable expectation of privacy of a Canadian or a person in Canada, or contravene an Act of Parliament. For CSE's foreign intelligence and cybersecurity activities, these would be subject to approval by the Minister of National Defence and the Intelligence Commissioner. Active and defensive cyber operations are not collection activities and cannot be directed against Canadians or persons in Canada. As such, they would be approved by the Minister of National Defence and the Minister of Foreign Affairs. All of CSE's activities would also be subject to full review by dedicated independent review bodies. Monsieur le Président,
Mr. Chair, I'd like to conclude by thanking the committee for inviting me and my colleagues here today. Thank you for your important deliberations on this legislation. We look forward now to answering your questions. Thank you.
Ms. Bruce, and welcome to the committee for the first time, I understand. I hope it's not the last time. I believe that's the end of formal presentations. So with that, we'll turn to Mr. Spengman for 7 minutes.
Mr. Chair, thank you very much, and thank you to our witnesses for being here. Thank you for your service and your expertise. I'd like to start with a question to Mr. Brown. Mr. Brown, I wonder if you could briefly sketch for the committee your assessment of the strategic threat setting that the country faces in 2018, with particular attention to the two principal threats being cyber-directed activities and also the risk of terrorist attacks, violence, extremism, radicalization, both domestically grown or foreign inspired. How do those two compare against each other, and are there any other threats that we need to take note of in 2018?
6 minutes?
Not for that question, please. No, I've got a number of other ones.
Well, and I know in all seriousness, virtually everything I say, my colleagues will want to refine, correct, and make more precise. I think, but I will take a stab at it. I think you've identified two of the key issues. There's no question in terms of the current threat environment, in terms of counterterrorism and the realities that we are all facing, both as individuals and as any entity that we participate in, whether it's social or professional or as a government, in terms of the cyber threats we're confronting and the reality that it's sort of multifaceted. I would, though, also indicate that I think we continue, and this is clear in publicly released documents, both by the department and also CSIS, that the threat environment is more complex than that. It includes kind of traditional intelligence gathering by countries that are either competitors or wish us ill. I think as well we continue to face in terms of the counterterrorism environment, both foreign threats as well as domestic. So I think, I could, as I say, I could use up a lot of time very easily. But I think that's a snapshot, and I'm happy to, in subsequent questions.
To summarize your answer, is it fair to say that both the risk of violence, terrorism, extremism, and cyber attacks are two that cannot be subordinated or prioritized over each other. They're both equally significant in our current setting.
One of the hardest parts of the jobs that my colleagues in the agencies that are before you manage is actually constantly juggling that. The reality is all those threats that I've described, plus that you described, plus the other ones that I've identified, are constantly the subject of scrutiny by the agencies. At any given instant, finding the right balance is a very serious challenge.
Thank you for that. That's helpful. How confident are you that the bill in its current formulation captures what we might describe as unknown unknowns, especially in the cyber domain? If you look, for example, at the areas of artificial intelligence and quantum computing, and you connect that to the cyber threat environment, is the bill flexible enough to address emerging issues that we may not have turned our minds to?
Well, it's hard to predict the future. I will say that as the bill was drafted, there was an effort to provide, we recognize we do these things irregularly. The last time a significant overhaul of this was a review was undertaken was really a generation ago in terms of it all-encompassing characteristics. I do think the approach we all took in terms of the provision of advice and reflected in the government's decision was to create a framework that would, in fact, be flexible and adaptable enough to respond to emerging threats.
Okay. Thank you very much. My next question is for Ms. Bruce. Thank you for your clarification of the active cyber operations question. I think the Canadian public is really mindful of some issues that may not be apparent to them, I guess, in the sense of how complex an environment this is and how identifiable actions are in the minds of the Canadian public that ultimately would need to be taken to disrupt a threat. And your testimony gave a couple of examples, for example, disrupting or inactivating a cell phone that may be used in a detonation. It's also quite clear that we would not engage actively to threaten lives or to destroy lives. What about the area of collateral damage? For example, having to take down a portion of an electricity grid that may then cause civilian infrastructure problems and potentially put people at risk, not necessarily at risk of death. People might say, okay, what if we inadvertently deactivate power supplies to a hospital? Are there rules of engagement that are more that could be enunciated with greater granularity than what you've described at the moment that you could tell the committee about?
Thank you very much for your question. The environment is incredibly complex, as you state. The work that CSE does under its traditional mandates of foreign intelligence and cybersecurity allow us to build up a picture of the environment against which an active cyber operation might be delivered. And in that sense, an incredible amount of research and work and intelligence needs to be compiled to understand the foreign targets, the foreign infrastructure, what it's connected to, what the residual impacts might be if something were launched in that space. So a great deal of analysis needs to go into coming up with options for the government to consider in whether or not they want CSE to conduct an active cyber operation against a greater objective. In this sense, there are some big restrictions around how that works, including the requirement for it to be reasonable and proportionate. And two ministers, the Minister of National Defense as well as the Minister of Foreign Affairs, to sign off on that and understand what the implications could be. I might turn to my colleague to talk about some of the other restrictions and limitations that exist within that space that would guide our decision making.
Answer into another answer at some point because
Okay.
we're out of time, unfortunately. Monsieur Paulus.
Merci, Monsieur.
Thank you, Chair. Hello, everyone. Thank you for being here today. It's very useful. My first question, Mr. Brown, or for anyone who's here, it's in terms of the funding of terrorist groups. We've received Michael Netbook here today. He said that there was one concern. He said that Canada could be the theater of financing activities for terrorism and other activities. So this is possible. One of my colleagues, Tony Clement, has tabled a bill at the House, Bill C-371, And the first question we had from the government is that they don't want to support the bill, saying that C-59 or Canadian legislation has everything necessary to fight funding from secret means and funding for terrorism. So can you tell us anything about that? Perhaps I'll start, and then some of my colleagues can add additional information to my answer.
In addition to the changes that are proposed in C-59, the framework that is already available to the government in terms of addressing issues associated with terrorist financing are sufficient. I think generally speaking, in the context of C-59, the government is open to suggestions. I do think the perspectives in the private members bill that you've mentioned, there are some practical considerations that frankly make it problematic. That being said, I think we're constantly challenging ourselves to ensure that we have the tools, that all of the agencies have the tools they need to confront the challenges around terrorist financing. There are a variety of steps we can take, and at that, I'll let my colleagues jump in if they'd like, in terms of the tools that we have now that I think we believe gives us the capacity to respond as necessary. Gilles?
Peut-être au niveau pratique.
Perhaps on a practical level, what we're seeing on the ground in terms of terrorist funding in all of our investigations, we look at the various angles. However, the challenge that we're always facing is how the funds are used at the end of the line. It's really hard to prove how they're used because it goes to countries where there aren't necessary protocols in place for sharing information, or there are no necessary standards, evidence standards. So we're working actively, as my colleague stated, to make sure we have tools through other mechanisms in terms of information sharing and financial funding information. This way we can target the situation, but the challenge is always how we can collect the information and the standards in place. Thank you. Next question. In terms of information sharing, the former director of CSIS said that privacy is not mentioned in this bill, and this is amazing, surprising. I want to protect everyone's privacy, but sometimes I'm wondering that we're focusing too much on this subject because some people are afraid for national security. Can you explain?
On behalf of the Security Intelligence Service.
Sure. I guess I would say that I think that it's quite clear that this bill is able to accomplish the effective tools and the authorities that we need in order to be able to conduct our investigations. I think ensuring that we have confidence of Canadians, that we are able to do so in a manner that protects their privacy, is very critical to our being able to carry out our mandate. So I think that this has achieved both of those objectives.
Also, we heard Minister Farham, who talked about China and that employs 200,000 people for cyber operations. Do you think that Bill 55 allows us to better fight cyber threats from China and elsewhere? I'll start with an answer, and then I'll share my time with Shelley. I would say yes. No doubt. I'm sure that the modernization
in terms of being able to respond, this is long overdue in terms of the concept of a framework. I will also indicate that the government is in the midst of a cybersecurity strategy review, and the results of that will be known in the fullness of time. But that's another element of a response to your question, Shelley.
Merci pour votre question.
Thank you for your question. I'd like to answer in English because I'm not very comfortable with this vocabulary in French.
This is the environment that we're working in we're in a space where there's an increasing cyber threat surface out there. Hostile state actors and non-state actors are using the internet. We also have rapidly growing, evolving technology base within that space, and we have targets and our own citizens who are using that space. So all three of those combined make this a very, very challenging environment for us. But the legislation will provide us advanced tools and capabilities to address some of these issues, as well as provide the government the opportunity for CSE to be using its capabilities and its expertise for online activities in a way that could thwart or disrupt online threats before they materialize or become a crisis within Canada.
Merci.
Thank you, Mr. Palouse. Mr. Dubé, 7 minutes, please.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you all for being here. I'll apologize in advance if I seem rude. My time is fairly limited. Ms. Bruce, excuse me, I want to ask, you said mandate is important. Is that a legally defined mandate or the mandate that the organization gives itself?
It's a legally defined mandate.
Okay, thank you. And the Minister of National Defense is the one responsible for the powers that are in this bill. Can someone explain to me at the table then why it's been added to a bill that's been tabled by the Public Safety Minister? The Public Safety Minister comes before committee, and it's part of it's come to a committee that doesn't necessarily have the institutional memory that the National Defense Committee would have.
The short answer is, I think the decisions about which committee this should go to, we're merely servants. We come and testify before whoever would like to ask us the questions. Not for us to opine on the appropriateness or not
I appreciate
of the
that.
forum.
So why was it included in this bill then, these measures dealing with CSE specifically?
Because it's about updating a national security framework that includes, quite obviously, I think, the activities of an agency like CSE.
I appreciate that. The Ms. Bruce, going back to you, the Section 25 in Part 3 dealing with the privacy protections, one of the words that's used is, or some of the words that are used are in the disclosure of. The Minister has explained that the changes to SCISA that now use the word disclosure means information already in the possession of different agencies or departments. So in other words, when you're talking about the disclosure of information that you're obtaining through this research, does that mean that that information could be shared between different agencies and departments?
Go ahead.
Hi there. Just to be clear, right now we share information with other departments and agencies under our existing authorities. And when we do that through an end product report, an intelligence report. And that would continue the way it is now. There are privacy measures in place when we share that information, and those measures are reviewed. And in fact, how we do that is reviewed and has been reviewed for 20 years. So this will enshrine in legislation a practice that exists now with CSE.
Okay, I ask because one of the responses to the concerns, you said that you're not using the information that you're collecting under Section 24 to create profiles or do any kind of investigation, but does that preclude other agencies from potentially doing the same thing if you're disclosing the information you've collected to another agency and then it's beyond your mandate and anything that you would be doing with that information?
So when we say we need privacy measures in the disclosure of information, it means that in the course of our foreign intelligence operations or our cybersecurity, we may come across an entity, an IP address, an individual, a company that is unknown to us. So we need to do research from open sources to contextualize that and make sure we understand what we're dealing with. If it turns out that that individual, that company, that IP address is Canadian, then we put in place measures to mask that identity if that information leaves CSE. So it's about protecting that information.
And those measures aren't, because as the bill reads, it says you take measures, but essentially those are internal. They're
Nope.
almost, so what, there's no retention period, for example, which is often something that we see. So is there any way you can provide the committee with what specific measures you take to protect privacy and of the information collected under Section 24?
Under Section 24. As I said, the information that's not collected, it's consulted, it's research, that information that we use. And if that information is germane to foreign intelligence or cyber security reporting, then we will include a reference to that, but we would mask that. So we would suppress any Canadian information and replace that with a generic term. So instead of listing the Canadian IP address or the Canadian name, we would say Canadian person or a Canadian IP address.
I'll just add as well. So again, we cannot direct our activities at Canadians. We direct at foreign targets. If a foreign target talks about a Canadian or say call somebody in Canada and we pick that up, we have to destroy that information by legislation right now if it's not essential for international affairs, security, and defense. If we do retain it, then we have to count that, and we always count, would have to account for the fact that that information had been picked up, the fact that we destroyed it, or if we had retained it, why we'd retained it. That's reviewed now by the CSE commissioner. There are policies and procedures and things baked into our system that we actually have available on our website in terms of privacy fact sheet that breaks out all the different measures that are in place now. And we're reviewed on following those measures by the CSE commissioner.
Forgive me, because it's Section 24 specifically says, despite Section 23, which is the one that mentions the prohibition of targeting Canadians or persons in Canada. So it says, despite that, you collect publicly available information for, and it lists the reasons. And then 25 mentions these vague notions of measures being taken to prevent privacy. So I'm not, can you point me to the specific part of the bill that explicitly outlines what's done to protect privacy and where the things you're explaining about destroying that information or not keeping it? Because insofar as the information collected under Section 24 is concerned, I just don't see that.
So right now, what's in the bill is that the minister, in the ministerial authorization space, will lay out the privacy measures specific in that authorization on the use, retention, disposition of that information, and we have to follow that. And again, some of those elements are listed on our website now. I can walk through that. There's policies and procedures and training and what have you. I think an important element to underscore is that when it comes to disclosing, assisting other law enforcement departments and law enforcement security agencies under their mandates, the only way that we would assist them is if they come to us with their own lawful authorities under our assistance mandate, and then we would help them within the bounds of that lawful authority and that activity. So the kinds of things we're talking about here is that anything that we do in CSE, whether it's our intelligence collection, whether it's cybersecurity, whether it's publicly available information that we deal with, we have to have privacy measures in place because there could be things that engage our privacy interests. So those measures have to be there. So there's a range of things that, in terms of privacy measures, for the kinds of general research that we do, the kinds of intelligence collection activities that we do in support of Government Canada intelligence priorities, and the kinds of things that we do in response to requests from our
Okay, and when it comes to
Unfortunately, I do intend to be a little bit more flexible in the second hour, and so I think we can come back on a lot of these issues. Ms. Demroff, 7 minutes, please.
Thank you, Chair. I actually want to follow along the same line of questioning if I could. Because I'm still not clear when Canadians get caught up in this information gathering. So I have a couple of questions. You mentioned that you mask the identity, but you're keeping it. How long is it kept for? So how long do you keep that information for?
CSE does have a retention schedule, but we have not published those retention schedules at this time.
Is it ever destroyed?
Oh, yes.
And is that public?
We're required to, yeah. If it's not essential, there's a test right now that if it's not essential to international affairs, security, and defense, then that information has to be destroyed, and then we're reviewed for that.
And if it's retained, then it's protected.
So what if it is essential to Canadian national security? So you're out trolling the internet and you find something going on here and it's a Canadian. What happens to that information?
So CSE doesn't really troll the internet.
So that was a bad term.
Yeah.
My apologies. I guess what I was saying is you're not actively going out trying to find a Canadian.
Absolutely not.
But
We
you're
can-
out there and you're monitoring things, and a Canadian happens to fall into that, and they haven't necessarily committed a crime, but they're implicated in the conversations that are happening. So what do you do with that information?
So, as my colleague mentioned, if that information, as we are targeting and directing our activities at foreign entities who are outside of Canada and who are associated with a foreign intelligence requirement that the government has levied against us, if in the course of that activity we come across information about a Canadian that is not germane to the foreign intelligence at hand, then we destroy that information.
But what if it's germane,
If it's germane.
to Canada? So what if you've collected something and it could pose, because there was some mention about unless it's a national security threat. So what if you're collecting this information, a Canadian could be implicated in a Canadian national security issue. You don't notify anybody, it just sits there?
No, we do, if the information is germane to the foreign intelligence reporting that we're doing about a legitimate threat to the security of Canada, we would include that information and we would write it in an intelligence product, and that would be circulated to cleared clients within the Government of Canada who have top secret clearances and who are indoctrinated to receive the information. But that information would not explicitly identify a Canadian. It would have a term that has been used instead of the specific details. And if the client who is receiving that information wanted to understand the underlying information, what's behind that marker, they can make an application to CSE under in accordance with the Privacy Act, and they have to create a justification. They have to explain how it relates to their mandate, why they have the lawful authority to have this information. And then CSE may release that, and it is logged, and it is reviewed by the official or the CSE commissioner on an annual basis.
So one of the things I've asked a number of witnesses here, and I guess that's where it would come in, is whether ministerial authorization should be involved if you're going to be releasing that information to other departments when Canadians are involved. And a number of people, witnesses here, have said yes.
So I guess in terms of the ministerial authorizations and to capture how that is distinct from publicly available information is that under the ministerial authorizations, for any information that we acquire where there's a reasonable expectation of privacy or where we might interfere with it, that's why that's brought into the ambit of the ministerial authorization and also the secondary review by the Intelligence Commissioner. So then we go up, that authorizes us to undertake a class of activities, a series of activities in support of the foreign intelligence mandate.
But I'm specifically talking about you sharing, so you take your information and give it to CSIS. And right now, they apply, you decide, and you give, right? So putting a ministerial authorization in the middle of that to say before you're releasing any information on Canadians to another government agency that there should be ministerial authorization. So that doesn't exist now, right?
I guess the only thing I would say is that there are privacy protections that have to be laid out in the ministerial authorization, as well as the minister will designate under the CSE Act who can receive that information. So that is a new element in terms of that ministerial designation. So the minister will be engaged. The commissioner will be engaged with the activities we're undertaken within a ministerial authorization, as well as then will be reviewed by NCIRA.
Sure.
It works
Don't touch it.
automatically. It's magic.
Just waiting for the light to come on. I would just add that this is a really important question. And it's not just an important question for the mythology, which is much of what it is, around what CSE does or other organizations like CSE in other countries. The reality is the layers of protection for the transfer of information to protect privacy, but also to ensure that information is shared in a timely way, and the layers of review. So we have all the things that Scott and Shelley have described that govern the way they do it. It's not kind of willy-nilly, but we'll just toss it over.
No, and I wasn't implying
No,
that
I
they
know,
were.
but I just for the, I know you weren't, but I'm for
Yeah.
greater certainty, trying to make that point. But the other is that in the context, the receiving organization has a whole series of obligations as well in terms of the way they treat that information. And our friend, the Privacy Commissioner, and he is a friend, plays an important role in all that. As well as the obligations of people like me who run these departments have very serious obligations in terms of protecting the way that information is used and ensuring and justifying its retention for however long we might feel we need to have it.
And I think, you know, the world has changed. So 20 years ago, the conversation would have been much different, right? You're talking about personal conversations. They might be phone conversations. Now you've got so much personal information that is out there on the internet, and it's so much wider, the information that you can actually gather. So it's a very different conversation that we would have had even 10 years ago, right?
Yes and no. In terms of the authorities, I'll use it in terms of the way in which warrants are used now, in terms of the authorities that all these agencies have to go through in terms of accessing information. And this is a long tradition. So the reality is that, yes, it's different, but actually the underlying principles and the foundation in law are the same. And the way information is treated. We have to update our procedures and practices, and from time to time examine and ensure that they're still relevant. And I think this demonstrates what's in C-59 demonstrates quite a capacity to absorb change, to propose change. But it's important not to think that it's so different that we have to actually, not immediately, but jump to a new framework, because the consequences, we have to think through the consequence of it. And I think the challenge is to find the right balance to ensure that the concerns that you're describing about people feeling that their information isn't shared willy-nilly, is that those concerns are addressed by the way in which we manage the information. And there are the layers of scrutiny are so significant that I think we'll see. It's a prediction, and I know I've got to stop. I'm taking up your time.
Yeah.
But this is an important issue. So if the layers of scrutiny that are embedded in this bill, you have heard witnesses who feel it's too much of a burden.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Brown. And I just emphasize to colleagues that we do have a second hour, and you can come back on these issues if, in fact, these issues raise serious concerns in your mind. Mr. Motz, 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the officials for being here. I appreciate your role as bureaucrats and your hesitancy sometimes maybe to speak freely in a committee like this on matters like this, but we know this is a national security issues, and it's a chance that we have of why the bill's before us before second reading to make any adjustments that we need to, which we probably need to, obviously. Now, I'm going to start with you, Ms. Bruce, and I'll ask Mr. Brown as well the same question. You spoke about active and defensive cyber operations. Now, the legislation here in this bill sets out some very clear limits on its authorities and prohibits directing active cyber operations at Canadians, and as I read it, irregardless of where they might be in the world when that happens, and or any person in Canada. Now, are you confident or satisfied that these limitations and prohibitions are appropriate given our current climate of domestic threats with Canadians on Canadian soil?
Thank you for your question. I believe that the authorities that have been given to CSE in this bill reflect where our capabilities and our focus best lie, and that's with foreign targets outside of Canada and on foreign infrastructure. If there's a threat that materializes within Canada, we have the RCMP and CSIS who are already well placed with authorities to manage those threats. So I think it plays to CSE's strengths and to where it naturally gravitates to in that global network.
Mr. Brown?
The short answer is yes. I can enthusiasm respond in the affirmative that I think we are well positioned to be able to respond. The Act gives the full, a much more complete range of authorities with the appropriate safeguards. And I think our friends in CSIS have views on the same subject, if you'd permit them.
Yes, I definitely want to, as a continuation, ask CSIS and our RCMP witnesses who are here whether they share the same enthusiasm and support of this bill providing them the support they need, the legislation they need to protect Canadians from domestic terrorism.
Yes, sir. I'll speak for the service first of all. So I would say that this is a clear expression of our authorities and our tools, data analytics, threat reduction, and our the way in which we operate with human sources. I think these are really important clarifications that have been made. To your question to Ms. Bruce, I would say that this is where our mandates are quite complementary, because of course the threat reduction mandate and our role in cyber operations are permitted here in Canada. So this is where I think there's a nice synergy between what CSC is able to do and what we're able to do.
So maybe if I can add from a law enforcement perspective, this bill really touches more on criminal code, changes to the criminal code, and some of the provisions that exist there to assist us in making sure that we keep Canadians safe. It does not address, and the essence of your question, where in the backdrop of that is the technology challenges that we have. And that would be the aspect from a law enforcement where we've got the biggest gap. It's in our ability to navigate within our mandate with this new environment and these new challenges. However, I'm not sure that this is the bill that is set to address those issues.
Okay, thank you. And I apologize to the front end. When I use the term bureaucrats, I should have said public servants. I apologize for that. I didn't mean it as a slam in any way whatsoever. I apologize. There are legitimate concerns that have been expressed about foreign interference in our electoral process, like has been alleged to have occurred in the 2015 election. Now, are there enough powers in C-51 or C-59 and oversight of this bill to deal with foreign threats to our electoral process?
So the whole question of foreign interference is very complex, and it is, to be frank, a mixture of digital and analog. The reality is the objectives are the same. In many cases, probably the actors are the same. And so from the perspective of frankly, the additional powers authorities that are being, that you've already discussed with Shelley Bruce, I would say that's clearly filling a gap. The other authorities and, interference remains and has been a long-standing concern of the services and the public safety portfolio, and will continue to be. I think we, with the raising, the updating, modernization of the tools across the spectrum, puts us in a much better position to manage these challenges. Is it the final word? I think that's a mug's game, is to sort of saying you've done it, we don't need to think about it. I think it's something we're constantly examining as we examine every threat, and we would provide advice to the government if we thought when and if we think there are issues where there are gaps.
Thank you.
Mr. Brown, Monsieur Picard, 5 minutes, s'il vous plaît.
My question is for the CSC. This is not the first time we've appeared before our committee, but this is very interesting for our case at hand. We're talking about threats that come from abroad, because you don't look at what happens in Canada. So these threats are started abroad when you're surveilling and intercepting foreign activities, you come across conversations that involve Canadian citizens. So you have to destroy the information. How can you justify, then, to defend the rights and liberties of Canadians? And still, you need to have you have to prove that there's a threat or a reasonable doubt to conduct an investigation. So how can you build the argument of a threat if you're destroying the information on Canadians, if by doing so you're losing these patterns that could justify the evidence of a threat that is taking place. If the source is foreign, then it counts on collaboration of Canadian components as well. Thank you for your question.
Where we have acquired foreign intelligence intercepts that contain information about a Canadian that is germane, and it does indicate that there's a threat vector to Canada, or there are reasonable grounds to believe that it could be related to a threat. We keep that information. We do not destroy it. I understand that there may be, over time, patterns may build up, but those are the rules that we have. And in the interests of protecting the privacy of Canadians, if at the time of review we determine that there's no link or it is not germane to the foreign intelligence to a threat to Canada, then we destroy it.
Votre prémisse est bonne dans la mesure où vous évaluez.
Your premise is sound if you're evaluating the information that is intercepted as being a potential threat. However, the recruiter, usually in a first conversation, it doesn't ask someone, are you ready to kill for your country? That's very rare to hear that. So you kind of test out the market, you test people with ordinary conversations. So if during these conversations, given the information, if it doesn't offer any information in terms of a threat, because they're just testing out the market, does this create a difficulty? When do you change from this being a ordinary conversation to one that involves a threat?
Targeting foreign entities outside of Canada, we have to be very convinced that those foreign entities are linked to a foreign threat or a foreign intelligence priority of the government. Just because that person is speaking once to somebody who has an innocuous conversation does not mean we stop targeting the foreign entity. Okay. So any subsequent conversations with that foreign entity would also be reviewed, and analysts on those targets would appreciate over time if they sense a change in the behavior, or if there was a Canadian involved and they became more susceptible to radicalization, or, as you suggest,
Merci. Une dernière question, peut-être plus générale.
My last question is more general in nature. There's a report on terrorist threats from the department, and it says we haven't changed the act since 2014. Will this new legislation give you tools to help reduce threats? Of course, I hope so. But quite seriously, there's no doubt. There are new tools, important ones, in this bill.
It's kind of a demand-driven environment. Can I say today there are making up a number, 15 threats, and C-59 or some version of it is passed, and a year from now there'll be 14? No. Can I tell you that that I believe, and I think this is the view of the agencies, that C-59 provides important tools and assets to help reduce the threats Canada faces? The same answer I gave earlier. Unassuredly, yes. Does it reduce every threat? No.
No, of course. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Picard. Mr. Paulus, 5 minutes.
5 minutes, Mr. Paulus. Thank you, Chair. A quick question. I'd like to go back to funding, foreign funding. Global Affairs Canada, from what we've understood, they can have an influence. I'm sorry that the committee has refused to bring Global Affairs Canada here before our committee. So in terms of fighting foreign funding for terrorism, do you have a relationship with Global Affairs Canada on this front?
There's a broader interdepartmental group that tackles these issues. Department of Finance, Global Affairs, FinTrack, RCMP, CSIS, the portfolio, and our colleagues, some of the colleagues here. There's a broad group that looks at the financing of foreign terrorist organizations.
Good. Merci.
Thank you. I'd like you to explain something. I'm not sure who could answer my question, but right now there are several groups that have to report to the minister. There's the Information Commissioner, the Privacy Commissioner, there's a new parliamentary committee. So there's several groups that have to report to the minister in terms of protecting privacy. But on an operational level, what happens? How are you going to interact with all these groups, particularly in terms of CSIS? Thank you for your question.
Believe that we have obviously an obligation to our minister to ensure that we are meeting all of these expectations when it comes to privacy. We are quite comfortable with review. We have had a long history of our relationship with CERC, and I think they have been very good at ensuring that we are adhering to policies and procedures when it comes to privacy of Canadians. The new bill actually introduces a number of new, as you've pointed out, a number of new mechanisms to ensure that the privacy obligations are being met by the service. As I said at the outset, sir, I think that this is extremely important to us in terms of our ability to ensure Canadians have confidence in their security agencies. So I don't think that we are concerned about it. I think the privacy answers that we would be giving to the Privacy Commissioner or our review agencies would be identical, frankly.
Puis là-dessus, on peut s'entendre que
So we can agree that protecting privacy is important in Canada, but all the various layers, can they have an impact on security? Does all this mean that national security could be at risk because there's too many layers? There's the balance between privacy and national security. Do you see that could be conflictual?
And as I've said, sir, I honestly believe that this is actually quite critical that we're able to have the confidence of Canadians. I think that operations can be slowed down if Canadians lose confidence in their security agencies, if we actually have to stop and fence off data, for example, or other types of things. So it's really critical to us to be able to ensure that we have confidence in order to be able to move swiftly through operations.
Okay. Dans un concept plus large.
In a broader context, C-59 has been sent to committees before it goes to second reading at the House of Commons. The minister requested to work to see this bill. Is there things we could improve in your departments? You've all worked on this in drafting this bill. Now, with some retrospect, with some hindsight, are there things that you can tell the committee? Are there some things that you didn't think about at the time when you were writing it, or the situation has perhaps changed since? Is there things you can tell us that we could do to improve and make amendments to this bill?
As good bureaucrats, I'll speak for everyone. You'll understand that the advice that we'd provide on this advice we'll need to give the federal cabinet and through our ministers to the federal cabinet. I will say though that I think there are. The minister's made it very clear that he's open to, and I think Minister Sajjan as well, open to suggestions on how to improve the legislation. And I think we look forward to the advice. We've met, I think we both indicated, there have been conversations with stakeholders that continue to be held, and we look forward to the advice of the committee on what the changes may be, and we'll respond then, I think.
Thank you, Mr. Balouse. Ms. DeBrugen, 5 minutes.
Thank you. I have a number of questions, and I think we've been touching on a lot of issues about reasonable expectation of privacy and how that fits in. But might start there. This is in fact a question relating to Part 3 of the Act. I've read in a few places, I think it's been suggested by Professor Forsese and by the BCCLA, that there would be amendments made to Section 23 sub 3 and 4. I'm reading it through. That the changes would be that the exceptions, what would happen is there would be words added in. So I'll just read it to make it a little easier. So it says, activities carried out by the establishment in furtherance of the foreign intelligence aspect of its mandate must not contravene any other act of Parliament. That's the way it's worded. But then would add in or involve the acquisition of information in which a Canadian has a reasonable expectation of privacy, and then goes back to the wording we have, which is unless they are carried out under an authorization issued under the subsections. So because we've been talking a fair bit about reasonable expectations of privacy and how we manage that, as far as operationally, like the constraints of adding that in, do you think that concern is covered by other parts of the legislation, the other layers in there, or do you see the value of adding that in? I'm not asking from a policy point of view, but I'm just trying to see if you see it covered somewhere else.
So I think we're slightly constrained in responding to proposed. I think this is a proposal from Professor Forsese, correct?
Yeah.
So I think we're a little constrained as public servants responding to that. The government will take on. You've carefully parsed your question about it's not policy, but frankly it is. Okay. But I will let I'll let Shelley take a stab at trying to respond to the technical aspect of what you've raised.
Sure. Or Scott. I'm just eager to talk, Just to state that right now we are subject to the charter, and so there are not all the elements in the charter here. All legislation and activities are subject to the charter. The element that where we interfere with the reasonable expectation privacy, right now we do operate under that understanding that type of information, any kind of information, is subject to the ministerial authorization. So I guess the only thing I would say is Professor Forsese's suggestion on an explicit mention is not inconsistent with the implicit requirement that now that we do, where there's a reasonable expectation of privacy, any of that information needs to be covered under the MA.
Okay. Thanks. The other thing that came up, I was reading in the Citizens Lab a piece. It was an interesting piece. This is about the CSC, but that in providing defensive services, ultimately, there may have to be, say, purchases of malware or different types of things. And how would we protect ourselves from, in our defensive operations, in effect, supporting, say, the people developing the problems that are creating our defensive operations?
The purchase of malware does not necessarily come from those people who are generating the malware. There are organizations, antivirus companies, who will allow us to purchase that information from their own legitimate analysis and work. So we do work very closely with that community to understand what are the threats that are being covered by commercial software and services, so that we can focus then on those malware threats that are not currently covered, the more sophisticated ones that are not part of the current complement.
Right. We've talked a little bit about publicly available information, and I think one of the things maybe complicating things is that there are different layers of what people consider to be public. And one thing that's been raised by some folks is, what if there's, for example, a hacking incident and suddenly this information is made public, it's out there, but it was intended to be private in its first instance. How does that fall within the public? Like, what are our safeguards there?
So in CSE's instance, that information, anything that has been hacked or stolen and then been made available for purchase or is not included in the definition of publicly available information.
Thank you.
Mr. Dubé, for the final 5 minutes, please.
Thank you very much. Just on the active cyber operations, the Minister of National Defense is the one calling the shots, if you allow me the expression, and you exist through the National Defense Act. But CSC, and I know the answer to this, but just for the record, is a civilian organization, correct? And so when cyber operations are being done, so here we say, you use the term in the presentation, I'm going with the notes, cyber aggression by foreign states. So cyber aggression, we're not talking about, you're not phrasing it as an act of war per se. Then later on, disrupt a foreign threat actor. Is there not concern that a civilian organization that answers to the Minister of National Defense, essentially committing offensive actions against another state, could be perceived as an act of war and the legal consequences of that? Because we've had witnesses who've explained that because legally you're seen as a civilian organization, that muddies the water significantly, and that's where a lot of the concern comes from. I don't necessarily feel you've addressed that in your
Thank you for your question. There is no doubt that Canada and its allies face an increasing degree of threat from hostile state actors or hostile non-state actors out there. We work very closely, and we're part of the National Defense Portfolio, as you've mentioned. And in the recent defense policy review, the military has declared its interest in working in the cyber domain and developing a framework and a platform for that. You'll note as well in our legislation that we are asking, or the bill is set up in a way that would allow CSE to assist the Canadian Armed Forces under our assistance mandate. So we would be able to work more closely with them, depending on the conditions and the circumstances of activities that would need to be taken. So there is a potential for us to work more closely, delivering capabilities for them on the military level.
So just to be clear, if there is a need for essentially what I feel is almost being qualified as a counterattack to something that's being done by a foreign state actor, if the military is developing similar capabilities to what CSE has, if you're the Minister of National Defense, and how do you respond then? Are you looking to the military to take that action, or are you looking to CSE? And if the military is developing those capabilities, why should a civilian organization be taking action that a military actor could take against a foreign state?
It depends on the circumstances of the activity that is being defended against. In many cases, you will not be able to attribute that activity to a specific individual, but the more important issue is to stop that activity from happening before it becomes a crisis or before it materializes in the Canadian security space.
Which would fall under defensive then and not active.
I would add in, if I may, yeah. The capability exists with CSE now. One of the reasons National Defense, the Canadian Armed Forces, have been added to our assistance mandate, should they engage in cyber and support government-approved military operations, they could leverage our capabilities in that regard. So where it's in a military context, leveraging us. When it's outside of military context, and we have to keep in mind some of the things that we're talking about here would be if intellectual property is stolen from a Canadian company, we perhaps could go upstream and render that unreadable. This is not always in the stream of aggression and cyber war and that kind of thing. So there are civilian uses to this, and there are prohibitions built in to keep us within the swim lane of that, whether it's prohibitions against bodily harm and the like. And having the dual key of the Minister of National Defense and Minister of Foreign Affairs ensures that the kinds of activities that we're undertaking are consistent with international priorities and international law.
Thank you, Mr. Dubé. That completes our first round of questioning, but in keeping with our stellar reputation as the hardest working committee on the Hill, we will have no lunch break and continue to move on with a second round of questions. I just want to canvass colleagues as to whether we could drop it to 5-minute questions and just go back and forth. Similar structure, but 5 minutes, that gives us an opportunity to get in possibly 2 more questions. Mr. Dubé?
In the same rotation, I have 5 minutes, then I get bumped down like 5 or 6 speaking spots with only a 5-minute round at the outset. Is that?
Well, if you look at the clock, you're cooked if I stay with this current structure. So I'd take 2 5s as opposed to 1 7.
But I just got 7 and 5, and I would get 2 5s instead.
Yeah. Well, I know your level of generosity with your time is appreciated. Mr. Fragiskatos, 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to all of you for the work that you're doing and for being here today. My first question goes to Ms. Bruce. Could you reiterate the types of acts that would constitute an offensive cyber capability? Particular examples, if you could.
Sure. I guess I would just preface this by saying trying to achieve active cyber operations are meant to achieve an objective that the government has established, and that's a team sport. That means that we each are bringing our mandates and our authorities and our capabilities to this table. So it depends on, it really is a way of working together to figure out who has the right authority to address the right issue at the right time based on their skills, their mandates, and their authorities. In the case of CSE, we would see, I mentioned some in my opening remarks around interrupting or disrupting ISIL communications networks, media machines, in a way that would stop attack planning before things reach a crisis pitch, interrupting the spread of ransomware that's being pushed around the world, interrupting subversion to the democratic process. And as my colleague mentioned, we have instances in the past where sensitive information has been stolen from Canadian systems and exists on foreign systems abroad, and finding ways to go and corrupt that data or make it inaccessible to others who want to take advantage of it and use it for their own benefit.
Finding ways to protect banking systems, finding ways to protect potential attacks on electricity systems, for instance. This is all part of that.
Yep. Critical infrastructure. In the new legislative proposal, CSE would receive the authority to take the skills and the technology and the capabilities that have been developed to protect Government of Canada networks and to make that advice, guidance, and services available to critical infrastructure owners. If the critical infrastructure element has been designated by the minister as eligible for CSE assistance, and if that critical infrastructure element system owner has requested our assistance.
I asked the question because I think it's quite important to demystify some of the ideas around what actually constitutes an offensive cyber capability. This is obviously a new means of ensuring national security, and I think there's some myths built up around it. For instance, this committee has heard testimony from organizations such as Open Media, the BC Civil Liberties Association, who have implied, in the case of Open Media, they're quite direct about it, that we ought to, this committee and Canadians in general ought to be ought to be on the watch, because CSE could use this offensive cyber capability to undermine the democratic processes of other states. This is not the intent here, correct?
No, the active cyber operations require the approval of the minister and the Minister of Defense, as well as the Minister of Foreign Affairs, directed at foreign entities outside of Canada. Necessary, reasonable, proportionate are all factors they have to consider, cannot be achieved by any other means, and cannot cause harm or bodily harm or death, but also cannot subvert or obstruct democracy or the course of justice.
Thank you
so
very
there's
much.
An explicit prohibition there.
Thank you for that reassurance. Can you comment on where the proposed new offensive cyber capabilities that C-59 offers, where would that take us in terms of how we would compare to our Five Eyes allies in this particular area?
I am not an expert on all of our allies' authorities, but this generally brings us in line with the activities and the authorities that they have at their disposal, and positions us to be a coalition partner in various broader activities that go beyond a national scope.
Thank you very much. If I could, with the last question here, if I could ask anyone who wishes to take it. I've been reading the 2017 public report on the terrorist threat to Canada produced by Public Safety. In that report, there's a number of references to far-right extremism and what that means for Canada from a terrorist threat perspective. In the report, it says that a dedicated module on extreme right-wing groups is currently under development. It's being developed by the First Responder Terrorism Awareness Program team. And the report says that while far-right activity, far-right extremism has always been a concern, this is the first time it would seem, at least that's what the report implies, that a dedicated approach in the form of a module here has been created. So does this mean that public safety is, the Department of Public Safety is particularly concerned now more than ever about the threat of far-right extremism in Canada?
Scott's time is expired, and it's partly my fault, but I'm going to get you to respond, if you could, briefly, so that we can get in as many questions as we can.
Really briefly, I'm not sure I can say more than ever, but I will ask Gilles Michaud to respond on the specific question.
Yeah, so on that specific module, it's really a law enforcement push. So we've seen the increase of activities, and it's an aspect of the threat that we had taken our eyes off the ball, I guess, for a number of years. And right now there's a push to really delve into it. And with our police of jurisdiction, because that's where mainly those activities occur and where the responsibility lies, but trying to get a better understanding as to the existence of that threat and the level.
Thank you, Mr. Fragiskatos. Mr. Motts, 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you again for the group to be here. Back on the 30th of November, when many of you were here, I asked for a full costing, whether a full costing for the implementation of this bill had been done. I don't see that has been submitted to the committee yet, and I'm just asking that if you have, great. If you have not, if you could please do that for us. Specific to compliance requirements and the extra cost that would be for this bill would be awesome. Thank you. I want to get into the.
Are you asking that as an undertaking to the committee?
Yes, please.
And then Mr. Brown would say aye, yea, or nay. Okay.
Nay, an option. We'll endeavor to provide the.
You can claim some vague cabinet confidentiality or something.
Yes, no, there's some constraint, but I think we can provide more information. And as I was prepping for this, I have to say, yesterday I noticed that you'd asked a question and we hadn't responded, so we will respond to the specific question, and there'll be some other. It may come in sequence, but we'll get you some answers.
Now, in light of the recent domestic terrorist attacks in the UK, in Europe, obviously here in Canada, which involved acquisition and use of objects available to citizens, chemicals, vehicles, whatever, has the government reviewed the provisions of C-59 to ensure that it permits appropriate emergency disruptive activities, specific CSIS, including without warrant where required? Are you satisfied with disruptive powers under this bill?
Thank you for the question. Yes, I think we're very satisfied with this. We're glad to see that the government has reaffirmed its commitment to our warranted powers. I think it's another set of tools for the government to be able to respond, especially when the threats are very fast-paced and emerge quite quickly from time to time. We work obviously very closely with the RCMP, but it is a very effective tool.
And I'm just going to ask a follow-up question to that and have both colleagues from the RCMP answer it as well. But is there anything we can improve on in that area in this bill that isn't there yet, that you, in second thought, have said, you know what, it would be great if we had this in it?
It's not likely they can actually answer that question.
I appreciate that, but I mean, you'd think there'd be some freedom to get this right.
So, if I might, I think we're happy to take advice from the committee on how the bill might be improved, and then the government will undertake its assessment of those suggestions. That
Now,
would be
now
very
I want
welcome.
to use the bureaucratic term again, but that's okay, I won't.
Well, sometimes if it walks.
No, I hear you. No, thank you. So the RCMP share the same sentiment that that the bill contains provisions necessary and permits, where appropriate, the emergency disruptive activities without warrant that you require?
A lot of those authorities exist outside that bill that we already possess in order to intervene and disrupt any type of emerging threat.
Right. So, CISA's officers, do they, in this bill, have the authority in defined exigent circumstances to perform disruption activities to prevent imminent attack without a warrant?
I'm just conferring with my colleague here. Mary, go ahead and answer.
So, in terms of carrying out threat reduction measures, they can be carried out with a warrant or without a warrant. There's no, the bill doesn't address the issue of exigent circumstances. Non-warranted measures can be carried out, and really the time constraint is internal in terms of all the processes that we have to go through and the consultation with our partners to make sure that it is the appropriate course of action.
Okay, thank you.
Can I
Sorry,
just
go ahead.
add to that, and just to say that in those exigent circumstances, it would more than likely be the RCMP that would be acting in those situations.
Thank you. I have a limited time, I'm sure, left. I have one yes or no question. A previous witness at this committee expressed concern and suggested that the committee, if Bill C-59 passes as it's written, then, and this is probably supposed for you, Ms. Bruce, then CSC may interfere in the democratic electoral process in another country. Can you please confirm that CSC has no intentions of using its new powers to conduct interference in any democratic electoral process in any foreign country?
Yes, sir. In fact, there's an explicit prohibition in the Act that ensures that any act of cyber operation is not used to pervert or obstruct the course of justice or democracy.
Thank you.
I can think of at least one head of state to be relieved about that. Mr. Dubé.
Only one?
It's not a party position, I imagine. For CSC to start, since in your presentation, but this also is for CSIS as well when because it is mentioned in Part 4 as much as it is in Part 3 when it comes to this definition of publicly available information. The sense I've gotten, and from people who know better than I do, who've been before committee, is that up until now there's no definition in Canadian law. There's no jurisprudence about what publicly available information is. You've defined it as the sort of public resources that would be available to anyone in Canada. And one example that the Canadian Bar Association offered was, for example, information being sold by Facebook to advertisers, which arguably would be available to anyone if they were in that business, although it's not. So it's unclear to me whether we're talking about Googling someone whose Facebook doesn't have strong privacy settings, or whether we're actually talking about things that technically are available to anyone but wouldn't actually be. So my first question is if you can drill down that definition, and my second one is why there's no definition in the bill or in anywhere in Canadian law, and should there be a definition in the bill to make that more explicit?
I guess a few things. One is to make clear that this element is actually making explicit something that occurs now with respect to CSC. We use infrastructure information, which in the legislation states can include be linked to identifiable Canadian. We do that to understand the global information infrastructure on which we operate. We use it in some of the other ways that Shelley referred to in her statement. Talking about, again, that it has to be consistent with our mandate, so we're not a domestic investigative agency. We don't build dossiers on Canadians and can't cross-reference data for the purpose of going deeper into any Canadians' private activities. As well, as mentioned, the idea of stolen or hacked information would not be available for our use. I draw attention to Justice Canada and the charter statement that they released at the time of the tabling of this bill, where it talks about publicly available information and the reasons why that is a different kind of beast than that kind of information that has a reasonable expectation of privacy and that would be subsumed within the ambit of the ministerial authorization process.
Can I have a follow-up, but go ahead.
question on the social media. So our collection and the use of information is going to be continue to be guided by the Charter and about individuals' reasonable expectation of privacy, which, as you know, is evolving over time. So we're going to ensure that that's kept consistent. And further on the hacked or stolen data sets, we do not consider that to be publicly available. We could envision a scenario, though, where if our adversaries had access to a hacked or stolen data set, we might still want to be able to have the ability to retain it, but that would only be through the normal authorization process, so we would have to go to the federal court if it was Canadians' information, or the Information Commissioner if it was foreign.
So
I'm sorry, may I just add, I'm sorry, sir, but I
Just
didn't
quickly, 'cause my time
completely
is
answer your
limited.
last question, but publicly available information is included in the definitions of Part 3. So there is a specific definition there. Sorry.
Sorry, I don't have it in front of me. Could you, what the definition is?
Publicly available information, and you don't have the act in front of you, so I'll read it to you, means information that has been published or broadcast for public consumption, is accessible to the public on the global information infrastructure or otherwise, or is available to the public on request by subscription or by purchase.
All right, thank you. When it comes to when it comes to information acquired incidentally, is there any notion of why that would be retained? Because right now, I think it's in part in Part 24 when you talk about information acquired incidentally through the research that's done. Is there any reason why you would retain that information and not just put it back, sort of throw the fish back in the water if that's coming about? And I'm not clear with the authorizations when it comes to Part 24, because I think I'm pretty clear on the authorizations for information acquired incidentally for data sets with CSIS, less so in Part 3.
So I would just say that where there is that reasonable expectation privacy, any information that we use, and if there's any element of, say, information that, notwithstanding the publicly available information definition and those elements, if there's anything that hits that trigger of reasonable expectation, that's brought within the ministerial authorization process. We still will have the element of privacy measures applied to publicly available information in case there is a privacy interest triggered. But again, given that the Privacy Act requires that we only collect, use, and retain information consistent with our mandate, again, we cannot go outside of that mandate and use it in different ways. So we will be obviously reviewed for reasonableness, necessity, and our privacy measures. So the degree that there might be any concerns going forward on that would be obviously, I would think, captured by that review agency and drawn to our minister's attention.
Hey, Mr. Smingaman.
Ms. Bruce, just in the first round, we ran out of time as you were about to delegate to your colleague, Mr. Miller, on the question of, if that's the right term, rules of engagement for active cyber operations abroad. You then had a follow-up discussion with my colleague, Mr. Fragascatos. Mr. Miller, is there anything else you'd like to add in terms of clarifying what the framework is for conducting active cyber activities abroad, what the safeguards are?
No, thank you. I think it's been covered off. I guess the only thing that I would clarify is, in our legislation talks about active and defensive. The term offensive or what might constitute something that's more in the military space, it would be something under the authorities and the remit of the Canadian Armed Forces.
Okay. So, thank you very much. Mr. Brown, on the issue of domestic violence, terrorism, extremism, radicalization, perhaps using as one anecdotal example, the incident in St. Foy just over a year ago. How important in your assessment is our proactive work with Canadian young people? And I have the sense that the vast majority of these cases do involve young people of less than 35 years of age. 60 and 70-year-olds don't self-radicalize by my anecdotal knowledge. But what do we need to do within the framework that we have? How important is this work to counter violence and radicalization, and what are its principal elements?
There's no question it's a very important element. The principal element is the work that's led by the Canada Centre that operates out of the department, working with local community groups, providing funding and support for initiatives in Montreal, Calgary, Toronto, across the country. in part because the solutions in Calgary will be different than the solutions for Montreal. And so that's really a key part of a response to that particularly vulnerable age group.
Are we, as Canada, out front on this challenge, or are there experiences within, say, the Five Eyes that could be useful in constructing our own framework?
I would say, actually, we are leaders. We work closely, particularly, but not only with Five Eye partners in understanding trends, but again, in the same way that the interventions in Calgary are different than the interventions in Montreal, the interventions in Sydney, Australia will be different than the interventions in Canada. But I would say we are very well positioned relative to our colleagues, and I think based on conversations we've had at a recent G7 meeting in the fall, it was very clear that Canada is playing a leadership role.
Thank you very much. Mr. Chair, my final question is to Mr. Breithaupt. On the assumption that we're dealing primarily with young people when we're talking about domestic terror threats or radicalization, extremist threats, do you have any thoughts on the current framework of the bill that speaks particularly to the Youth Criminal Justice Act provisions, sections 159 to 164? Are there any ideas, any thoughts in terms of further improving those provisions, or are you satisfied that this will adequately protect Canadian youth?
Well, thank you for the question. I think I'll just talk a little bit about those proposed amendments. The Youth Criminal Justice Act recognizes that young persons have special guarantees of rights and freedoms, and it contains a number of significant legal safeguards to ensure that they're treated fairly and their rights are fully protected. So this bill is, Part 8 of this bill is aimed at ensuring that all youth who are involved in the criminal justice system due to terrorism-related conduct are afforded enhanced procedural and other protections that the Youth Criminal Justice Act provides. It ensures, for example, that youth protections apply in relation to recognizance orders, and clarifies that youth justice courts have exclusive jurisdiction to impose these orders on youth, and ensures, for example, if a young person were to come before the Youth Justice Court on an application for a terrorism peace bond and is not represented by a lawyer, the amendments here would require the court to advise the young person of his right to retain and instruct counsel, refer the young person to any available legal aid program, and if the young person is unable to obtain counsel through the program, direct that young person to be represented by counsel provided by the state upon request of the young person. So there's more discussion internationally about the effects of terrorism on the juvenile justice system, and these proposals for amendments to the Youth Criminal Justice Act are to enhance protections of youth where in proceedings where recognizance with conditions and terrorism peace bonds apply, but it also provides for access to youth records for the purposes of administering the Canadian passport order, subject to the privacy protections of the Act.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Mr. Balouz, 5 minutes, s'il vous plaît.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Chair. If you're talking about ISIS fighters, we know that there's 180 Canadians who have done jihad elsewhere in the world, and there's about 60 of them who are recognized in Canada, 10 of whom are being followed very closely by police services and by CSIS, but there's a legal issue. Will C-59 help Canada to take measures to deport these people or take them to court if they represent a threat to Canadian security?
No uniquely specific provisions in C-59 to deal with the question of violent extremist travelers. There are elements of C-59 that, provide the tools and assets for the agencies that will improve our ability to safeguard Canada from any threats they may present. I will also say, though, that the there are a variety of tools that are available to the government, to all of us who are here and others, to manage and assess and take action as necessary to protect Canadians and ensure where there is the evidence that prosecutions can be launched against these individuals.
J'ai justement un exemple que je voudrais voir avec.
I have an example I'd like to mention. We learned Friday that Jack Letts, Jihadi Jack, has double citizenship, Canadian and UK. And Great Britain doesn't want to have them there. So he's putting pressure on our government to come here. There's a evidence issue. So if he comes to Canada, he'll be free, because if we say there's any issues, we won't have the evidence to back it up. So the Five Eyes or others, can we have evidence that could to support him here, or?
About talking about a specific case. So I think we'll need to respond in a general way to the question you're raising. With that, I'll turn it over to Monsieur Michaud.
Lorsque ça vient le temps
When it's time to do an investigation on Canadians who have lived abroad, the work starts abroad. So we have ties with police services in other countries, and that's where the work starts. We gather the information and gather the evidence. And then once the individual returns home, there are other measures that can be implemented. We continue our work to establish whether this person does pose a threat, and if we do have the necessary evidence, to charge them. Then there's a criminal aspect as well, and there's also the preventive aspect. These people don't have a criminal past, and they have other roles to play, and so that's when we use other organizations to follow up their return to Canada. In terms of the CSE, right now, if I'm not mistaken, the CSE and the Department of Defense, in terms of financing and operations, the CSE will be associated with the Department of Defense in terms of public safety. Is that correct?
The portfolio of the Minister of National Defense, and that is mentioned within the bill itself. Yeah.
Mais, OK. Au bout de la ligne, ma question, est-ce que...
At the end of the day, my question is that, for you, will Bill C-59 make a difference? Does your function still remain the same, or will there be any significant change?
As we are as a standalone agency, is there a change in that?
Operationally speaking?
No, not. I mean, obviously, in terms of the mandate additions and that would be new. But in terms of how we function now within the defense portfolio, that remains the same. In fact, this legislation has these housekeeping provisions in it that before we were a standalone agency by way of an order of council in 2011. Now we'll be actually more of a creature of legislation with the Standalone Act. And then again, it will make transparent a number of the provisions under which we operate as well.
Thank you.
Monsieur Picard, 5 minutes.
Question va au...
So, CSIS and RCMP. In this bill, we haven't forgotten, but it's not mentioned. Terrorist financing is a reality, but the current trend means that it costs less and less to finance these activities. They can steal trucks or whatever. So there's a whole new financial aspect. In the current situation, should we reestablish our report with FinTrack? Or do we have already legal means to work with this organization? Is this enough? Do we have to look at something in C59 in terms of dealing with FinTrack? In terms of our relationship with FinTrack, we are able to work with them, and it gives us some flexibility when threats can increase. And it can change after a while. We always can work and exchange information together. So I think we have, and the legislation already allows us already to work in any circumstance with them. I just wanted to add that there is a 5-year review process.
Title of the act?
Proceeds of Crime, Money Laundering, Terrorist Financing Act is now in its 5-year review, and the Department of Finance has put out a discussion paper actually asking questions or feedback on how to improve the act.
Yep, I would concur with my colleague. I think we work very closely with FinTrack, and I don't believe that there are any changes required there. We invest counterterrorism investigations, and as one aspect of that, the terror financing aspect of it.
Thank you. Mr. Brown, C50...
Mr. Brown, C59. It changes the various agencies' capacity to surveil. What type of impact will it have on the surveillance abilities of your agency? This question was raised during the first hour of the meeting. I think, yes, of course, there will be an impact. A positive one.
I think have greater clarity over what their expectations are. One of the objectives, and this was an issue that we discussed, frankly, in the early days of the deliberations around the legislation, which was a recognition that there were gaps in the accountability regime, but how to ensure that those gaps were filled that didn't have a direct and negative impact on the operational capabilities of the agencies. Part of that is through greater clarity and expectation. The other expectation is that we will, and it's quite clear, expect, and it's in the NSI COP legislation, for example, the requirement for NSI COP and SURA to consult and work with each other to ensure that they, frankly, don't overlap unnecessarily, that they coordinate their activities. There's no question that this will result, we think, this is one of the objectives, I think, is greater transparency and a greater public understanding of what all of us do on a daily basis. We're also taking steps to, frankly, simplify the process through the Transparency Initiative, where information will be out now. The objective is information that, frankly, shouldn't be withheld, can be shared publicly, which, frankly, should eliminate steps where we're going through access to information or whatever kinds of processes to release information that if we could release proactively, we're lightening the burden. So I fully recognize there's been some commentary about that there's an increased burden. But as Tricia has mentioned, each of the deputy heads have indicated that they welcome and can function effectively within the proposed framework for oversight and review.
Thank you, Mr. Picard. Mr. Motts, 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My colleague mentioned it or started the conversation briefly, and it was actually talked about by a witness as well to this committee about the issue of intelligence to evidence and the inability to bring intelligence gathered elsewhere into the courts as evidence without compromising national security and informant or other issues. Now, does this bill do anything to empower our law enforcement officials or public prosecutions on the issues of national security?
You may have noticed there's some nodding and long faces. This is a very complicated issue. and working with our friends in the Department of Justice, there are conversations, discussions going on, because it is it's a justice and public safety dialogue with our colleagues in the provinces and the territories. There is, I would say, general consensus that we need to do better, but we do not have, the C-59 doesn't propose changes. We are actively engaging with our colleagues in the Department of Justice, as I say, on ways to improve the status quo, and that also engagement with provincial jurisdictions as well.
Thank you, Mr. Brown. If I can be so bold as to interpret what you've just told me, is that maybe C-59 should be strengthened in that area?
Well, that's for the committee to make a
I appreciate that
determination on. I will say that it's a very complicated issue. That frankly, from the official's perspective and engaging, I don't think I'm revealing anything. I probably am, but revealing anything in terms of deliberations with provincial colleagues. It's an issue under active discussion, and there is no consensus, and that is a problem, a challenge for us all.
So I think if and I won't pursue it in that line. I would be so brave as to suggest then that maybe that this bill C-59 should include some provision to work with other departments in order to make that happen and stronger, if I'm hearing what you're providing for us. So
I'm not sure we need a legislative provision for that. This is an issue that is really important, and that we're, as I say, actively engaged. To the extent that the challenge is, to be frank, there are quite profound issues around the way information is gathered and the constraints on how it can be shared, the extent to which it's effective and its impact on the functioning of the court system at both the federal and provincial level. So there are discussions and processes currently underway. I would say officials are seized with trying to make progress. I think one of the challenges is that there are very strongly held views on this issue across the spectrum.
Thank you, Mr. Brown. My last question, nothing that I can see in this bill really speaks to or deals with the issues like ACON and the proposed takeover of ACON and the sale of sensitive or national assets to China or other similar type countries. Can you walk us through what role CSIS might play in this process, and if there's any changes needed in this act to improve that? And other departments that are here can also comment as well in the time that I have remaining.
Sure. Certainly this is a part of our mandate, and we participate with other government agencies and departments in providing advice to the government. And that is obviously quite secret advice that we provide, but the Governor and Council can certainly allow, disallow, impose mitigation measures on investments. You probably know how the process works. We do have capacity within CSIS to support this, but as you probably note, it is certainly an area where there's a significant amount of pressure, and it requires a considerable amount of effort from the service.
Does C-59 offer any strength to your role in that process?
I think the tools and the authorities that were provided for in 59, I would probably look at the data analytic provision as one example, are certainly going to support us in that work.
Great. Thank you.
Dana, 5 minutes.
I just have one question. Following up on questions that my colleague was asking, but in terms of changes that have been made in C-59 to the CRCC, the Civilian Review Complaint Commission, and the RCMP specifically, how will that impact the RCMP, and do you anticipate that it will work better under C-59? I'm just wondering if you can give us a little more information, and I'm not sure if it would be you, Mr. Brown, or the RCMP that would respond to that.
Well, just really briefly, in some ways we're trying to clarify where CRCC's lines are and where NSERA will be in terms of the conduct of national security reviews. Conduct complaints and those kinds of things, again, I think is clarified. But Gilles?
So from an agency perspective, I think that is a welcome change, because when it comes to our national security mandate, very rarely that we exercise it in isolation. It's always working with our partners, those that are sitting at a table, CBSA, etc. So as a review is ordered on some of our activities, very difficult for a single agency to look at it unless you look across the spectrum of those that are involved. So from our perspective, it's a welcome change.
Okay, thank you. I don't have any other questions, Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Dubé. 5 minutes, and then I may exercise a chair prerogative and ask a question or two of my own.
Yeah, thank you,
Shocking,
Chair.
shocking, yes.
And the this perhaps for our representative from the Department of Justice, but in the charter compliance statement, there is mention when it comes to publicly available information about the expectation of privacy, which would be considered low for that type of information. How is that concept, and I say this as someone who's not a lawyer, how has that concept changed in law in terms of the expectation people have? So in other words, just going back to that example of, I think very few people are really aware of information that could be purchased legally, for example, that could technically fall under that definition. So is the expectation of privacy and the reasonable expectation of privacy, has that changed with the advent of the use of things like social media and such, where we can arguably state that there's a lack of knowledge on that front?
Well, yeah, I know Doug's here more in the policy capacity than the charter expert capacity, so I'm happy to to address that. I guess a couple of things to keep in mind is one, again, will be reviewed for lawfulness. The ministerial authorizations that we will have or that we will seek that capture any information that we comes into our possession where there would be a reasonable expectation of privacy. That is, when we put together those authorizations, the Department of Justice is part of reviewing those authorizations. They're kind of like affidavits, if you will, to make sure that we've sufficiently captured that space. So I guess, you know, as the publicly available information is laid out here, the idea is that it was public, was intended to be public. So to the degree that any information we require under those provisions or acquire under those provisions would have to meet those kinds of tests, and those tests will be, you know, again, reviewed and commented on going forward.
So if we take the example of assessing the nationality of an individual and organization, can you walk me through what that means specifically?
As my colleague has also already mentioned, this is not new. CSE has to take these kinds of unknown entities and elements of information and try and flesh them out to understand exactly what we're dealing with. So it could be as simple as a Google search. It could be looking or working with other databases that are out there that might help us contextualize this. In the case of an IP address, there are registries that exist online that tell you where an IP address is
Excuse me,
geographically
so when you
registered.
say other databases, like that's pretty wide open. What, can you give an example of something like that? Because that's seems troubling to me, that kind of phrasing, with all due respect.
I guess probably the best I can do to reassure you is to say that we've had a commissioner who has reviewed CSE's activities for privacy for the past more than 20 years. And in assessing our activities and looking for privacy concerns or lawfulness, he touches on these kinds of activities, the open source research that we do to support our activities, because a lot of our activities require this to be effective. And he has not, to my knowledge, ever found any issue with the degree of research that CSE has done, the sources that we have accessed, or how we have handled and managed that information. I don't know if you have any.
No, that's correct. And I guess the other thing to underscore is that, again, these activities are in furtherance of our mandate. And I think an important thing to underscore here, we haven't had the opportunity to talk about much yet, but keep in mind that some of those activities involve us doing cybersecurity on Government Canada networks and systems. Those same networks that hold taxpayer information, employment insurance information, very sensitive private Canadian information, and our sensors block up to 1 billion malicious cyber incidents a day. That's cyber threat actors looking for vulnerabilities or indeed trying to attack. So the reason I mention that is because I recognize the discussion about the degree that private information, is are we both dealing with security and privacy information in a reasonable and proportionate way, but just really underscore as well that part of our mandate is actually protecting private information of Canadians. So the degree that we do these activities is in furtherance of that kind of information protection
So
mandate.
in terms of the measures that you take that aren't known to the public, this is the challenge, right? Because you mentioned there's some things you do with regards to protecting privacy of information in terms of, for example, when it's in Section 25, that kind of thing. Is there any way, as parliamentarians, we can be made aware of what's being done? Because unfortunately, my reading of the bill, it seems to be these measures are there, and you're saying you take them, and beyond that, we don't necessarily know.
We do have on our website a fact sheet that outlines the measures that we take to protect privacy at the moment. As technology evolves, as information evolves, we need to make sure that we're staying current and adopting more and more effective measures to protect privacy. So they are not captured in legislation, but they are captured in ministerial authorizations. And the minister can lay out his expectations, and he can increase those expectations and any parameters in terms of how we work as part of those authorizations, which are required to be renewed every year.
If I may add as well, and I incompletely answered a previous question about what changes under this legislation for us. I talked about mandates, I talked about other things. The accountability and review measures build upon the existing robust measures that we've had to date with the CSE Commissioner, but that element of NCIRA, the review agency, and with the Committee of Parliamentarians, gives that element where folks that are cleared and can see the full aspect of what we do, whether in an unclassified or classified space, can review us for all those elements of reasonableness and proportionality. The legislation as well makes more transparent, and transparent as much as you can in a piece of legislation, the activities that we undertake, under what restrictions we do it, the prohibitions and that. We are trying to put out more and more on our website. We are a clandestine agency that needs to act clandestinely in order to understand the threat picture and protect Canada. But we are looking, and we're getting out there. We're on Twitter. We're pushing out democratic institution reports and like threats against democratic institutions. So we'll always be looking for ways that we can share more about what it is that we do.
And I would say this.
And I do have a question, and if you don't mind. And I want to pick up on the interchange between Ms. Bruce and Mr. Fragiskatos concerning if you will, the private infrastructure. This conversation has largely been devoted to public infrastructure. And it reminded me of a conversation I had last week with a representative of the banking industry. And his comment was, when we feed information into the security services, it just disappears and we never hear from it again. It seems to me that this infrastructure, this cyber infrastructure, is actually a shared infrastructure between private and public, and C-59 doesn't speak, obviously doesn't, it's not obvious at least, that it speaks to that private infrastructure piece. So this has been an issue that has consumed the British, and the British have, the British government has intervened quite actively in protecting private infrastructure. So the question is, 59 as is, what contribution in terms of a framework does it make? And the second is the next piece, if you will, addressing that issue.
Question. The bill does not refer specifically to critical infrastructure, but I think it makes reference to non-governmental systems, which is tantamount to critical infrastructure, because as you say, it's made up of our global information infrastructure is made up of public and private enterprises. In that space, CSE, who is currently focused on defending and blocking activities on the government infrastructure, is limited right now to providing advice and guidance only to critical infrastructure owners in a way that that information is available to the general public. In this regard, C59 opens up CSE to take the expertise that has been developed, the tools, the capabilities, and in fact, some of that capability has been exposed to critical infrastructure owners in the form of a tool called Assembly Line. We've put it out there. It's an in-house developed tool, but we've made it available to others who could use this to help triage and understand malware that might be affecting their systems. CSE will be able to go even further in the with this legislation to helping infrastructure sector owners, critical infrastructure owners who request our assistance and whom the minister has designated as eligible to receive assistance from CSE.
And how will that actually occur in a formal sort of way? I can think of institutions that have massive structures, possibly as large as government structures. And how will that operate in a practical sort of way so that everyone's interest is protected?
That's a good question. Thank you. As the legislation firms up and we understand what the scope is and should these authorities be granted, it will be up to CSE to work with public safety and critical infrastructure owners, the minister to look at where the risks are and to start designating and prioritizing, because as you point out, it will be impossible to address all of the concerns and all of the infrastructures that exist in Canadian.
So some of this falls under the ambit of the Minister of Public Safety. And you're asking kind of a framework question and the way in which we're going to, the government's going to approach it. This is an important building block. It was a gap within CSE's mandates that they were constrained on the help they could provide in the existing context. The government, as I said before, is on conducting a cybersecurity review. The results of that will be, I hope, available shortly. But one of the key pieces in this, and public safety manages a relationship with the critical infrastructure sectors, and it's as much about knowing where to go, who to call when there's an issue, and the fact that it's actually not about the size of the systems. It's about having the right connections. And right now, they call sometimes CSE, and they call our critical emergency response, cyber emergency response team, CSIRC at CBSA at Public Safety, and we need to do a better job of coordinating that. But much of this information is in an ecosystem where it needs to get shared really quickly. And that's a key role that CSE can play. It's about technical expertise. It's not necessarily about, I'll use an analogy of a fire. We send fighters to a fire. In this instance, it might be one firefighter because it's actually just a connection that needs to be made so people understand this is the fix, and the fix can be applied across the entire infrastructure. There's a unnamed large American company that dealt with a lot of people's private data. It was one simple fix that was missed, and it has a profound impact on the entire organization. So it's important to frame this, and I think we'll see in the coming months a further elaboration. This is one important building block.
Okay. Well, thank you, Mr. Brown, for that penultimate last word. And colleagues, we have one more day on this. Next Thursday, we have two witnesses scheduled, but a certain unnamed academic has suggested that we hear from the Civilian Review and Complaints Commission for the RCMP, and they are available, and I propose that we add them to the list, and that will do it for Thursday. And then I also propose that the subcommittee get together Thursday afternoon after witnesses and sketch out how we get to clause by clause. So with that, I want to thank each and every one of you for your contribution to our deliberations. You've certainly been very able and responsive to all of the questions we've asked. Thank you again. Meeting adjourned.